I have the interesting topic of following Sasha and finding something different to say after he's covered most of the key ground, but topic has given me the excuse of coming to this from a kind of war stories, how it all goes wrong, how to fix it perspective. So a quick bit about me, because new firm. Why am I qualified to be here? Well, we are sort of one of the leading media-facing firms. I've been working in the connected TV space since 1996 when we talked about interactive TV, but it's kind of the same thing in a slightly different way. We are now over 65 offices in 35 countries, so we see this from a very global perspective. And that's where we are, okay, and that's what we do. So what are the answers? The answers are that data privacy, compliance, and customer experience, broadly speaking, are converging. So whilst the legislative position is moving in one direction, the consumer expectation is moving in a very similar direction. So where you have things that consumers care about, and that's not always the case, then they will have expectations of how their data is going to be treated, and those expectations are, broadly speaking, the same as where you end up on the legislative front. Sasha's already said that this is largely about compliance as far as possible, and a lot of it is actually consistent with common sense. So, the obvious things are, practical solutions. Treat everything as personal data, okay? Assume that 90% plus of the stuff you're handling is going to be personal, then why don't you treat all of it as personal and treat it all in the same way? In terms of data minimization, well, there's a cost to retaining data rather than applying that huge vacuum cleaner approach and just keeping everything. Think about how long every piece of data is valuable and consider anonymization and pseudonymization. If you want to keep data for a long time, then remove all the personal identifiable stuff from it and just keep an anonymized version. And keeping data secure has been, and it's very easy to say this week, and more or less every week, you've got a data horror story, haven't you? Or a leak horror story or a hack horror story. So keeping data secure is fundamentally a brand protection issue these days. So whilst there is a huge amount of sort of legislative movement and a need to be very careful about the compliance regime and to tick a whole bunch of boxes, the real thing is to engage your consumers in a way that allows them to understand what you're doing and to put trust in you. And it's part of the broader consumer trust equation, as well as being about specifics. The other thing I think is really important is the supply chain piece that Sasha has already talked about. We're moving from an environment where the end customer relating entity, so in a connected TV world, the platform operator has been the person who has the sole legal liability, to a situation where that responsibility and the legal obligations are moving further up the supply chain. So it doesn't matter where you sit in the supply chain, you are at risk to the extent that you are responsible for the piece of the puzzle that falls down. And that is actually consistent with, and getting that supply chain piece right is consistent with absolutely every data breach scenario we come across. So it's quite hard to do these because most clients don't really like us talking about their data breach situations, funnily enough. But I'll try and do one in an anonymous way. We had a large client that had a significant data breach. The first problem was they didn't find out about the data breach for some time because the vendor who was actually holding the piece of data and who'd actually had the violation, who'd actually had their servers hacked, didn't tell them. So the first thing you need to do is make sure your vendor arrangements have a proper processes and disclosures and compliance verification and audit processes. I'm increasingly seeing the data compliance schedules on RFPs, ITTs and so on are becoming very detailed, and we will only see as GDPR comes into force in just under a year's time, we're going to see that increasingly focused upon. So the second piece is, okay, so you've got a piece of paper that says, supplier, if you screw up, you've got to tell me straight away. How do you enforce that in practice? How do you actually build that into your day-to-day comms? How do you build it into your processes? And one way of doing it is to do fire drills. So actually, this is an area you see wherever you have regulators coming in and the ability to throw down big fines. One of the things us lawyers get quite keen on doing is training exercises and dawn raid training. So for antitrust, where there have been 10% of global turnover fines, these things happen on a regular basis, and I think we will see them happening increasingly in terms of a data breach scenario. So what happens is that you create a fake data breach and you watch how the systems respond. You create a scenario and you see how people respond, and it's internal within the organization and it's in the supply chain. And having those regularly and sensitizing people is a key part of how you stop these things happening. Because one of the things is you just don't know, right? You don't know where the data violation is going to come from. Actually, I have to say, if you're in a connected TV world, you have it relatively easy. If you look at a bricks and mortar retailer, okay, he's got somebody sitting at a customer service desk at a checkout somewhere. They leave a list of names on the counter and they go and get a cup of coffee. That's a data breach. Okay, how do you manage that? If you are in a connected TV environment, at least the chances are, because it's a sort of an end-to-end environment, you're able to identify when and where breaches occur. But you need to have the responses ready, and that's the responses to the regulator. As Sasha has already said, there are obligations now to notify, will be under GDPR, obligations to notify the regulator of every data breach which potentially has material consequences. You need to know how to deal with the customers. If you want the horror story of that, is actually go back and read Sony's response to the hack, or go and read what TalkTalk did. So TalkTalk had a massive loss of what ended up as being 150,000 customers' data. First thing they said, do you know what? This only affects a few people. And don't worry, because they haven't got any, they've only got names and email addresses, they haven't got any sensitive detail. And then they went back and said, actually, there's a few more people, and yes, they have got your billing details as well. And then they had to come clean. So you need to have a strategy of communicating this quickly, effectively, and without instilling panic, because it's all about the trust relationship between you and your customers again. And the final point I was going to make, which is, again, consistent with what Sasha has already said, is the importance of privacy by design and privacy impact assessments in the new world. Whenever you're developing a complex big data solution, particularly if it's a multi-territory one, you will need to have a privacy impact assessment. You need to build in the ability to audit decisions. And you need to ensure that you are following best practice. One of the things we're seeing at clients increasingly as we go through these processes is the development of data ethics boards. We have clients who now have their own data ethics board because actually they believe being able to tell the customer the story of how they believe treating data, valuable data carefully is important. Now, I'm going to slightly preempt what I know someone else is likely to say, which is the reality is that 90% of your customers will never give a damn about this data protection stuff, and they will just tick the box and they'll just get on with it. But the people who really are affected by it, who are privacy, they're the people who are just carrying the sword and believing the value of privacy, the troublemakers. Now, the troublemakers have already caused the EU law to be changed to be much more conservative than it ever is. The troublemakers got rid of the international agreement between between the EU and the US to share private data. So the troublemakers are out there, and the scary thing about it is not only can the regulators come after you, but the troublemakers can come after you too. I'll leave it to the following speaker to talk about the situation in the US, but even in the UK and in Europe, we are beginning to see private actions by people who have been harmed by data breaches. So we acted for a bunch of Safari users who followed a US class action with bringing a set of cases here which involved Google having to pay out some money in settlement. So I will leave it there, and subject to any questions, hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, John. Any questions for John? I've got one. Who is the shining example right now? Who could you look at as a best practice? I often hear Apple cited as being someone who a company that is doing it in the best possible way. Is that a good example? Are there better examples?
Actually, in a TV environment, the one I think is probably doing the most is Channel 4 in the UK. So Channel 4, for those of you not from the UK, Channel 4, publicly owned but not publicly funded entirely from ad and other revenue streams. They were one of the first people to put a mandatory registration gate in front of their on-demand offering, and they have been phenomenally successful. They have somewhere over half of all 16 to 34-year-olds in the UK on their database, and that's their sort of core key demographic.
And they also have done third-party data deals, right?
They have done
ad tech deals and all of that.
Yeah,
so
they are passionate data evangelists. Yeah. But the way they have communicated their data policies and data strategies has been very much market-leading. They've got a well-known comedian, a guy called Alan Carr. Again, if you're not from the UK, you won't know him. Who they've done a series of videos explaining how they handle your data, how you can withdraw your consent, and they have really done a huge amount in trying to put it at a level where the consumer can understand.
Great, good. Thank you again, John.